The reality of it was like a kung fu movie. The Type 63 was murdered, but his orphan son hid away in the southwestern mountains, mastered his father's style of kung fu, and then 10 years later, he emerged to avenge his father's death. Hello, friends. Welcome to Type 56, the story of China's army. I'm Jason Clower. If you ask Chinese people about the Type 81 Dash rifle, they will usually tell you three things. First, that the 81 Dash is a great rifle, and it's true. It's awesome. Second, it's totally not a Kalashnikov, they'll tell you. It's something quite unique. Well, I wouldn't go that far. It's true that the 81 Dash is not a Kalashnikov, but it's definitely not innovative or groundbreaking, and that's actually a good thing for China. It was a sign of their growing maturity in the 80s. Third, Chinese people will tell you, China developed the 81 Dash at warp speed. Friends, that turns out to be a baseless myth. And it shouldn't even exist because, as usual in China, the real story is so much more entertaining than the myth. Let's go through these one by one. First, the Type 81 Dash was a great rifle, and it solved the PLA's legendary problems with small arms, some of which went even deeper than we've talked about even in this course. The first of those problems was, of course, just weight of fire. Early in the war against Vietnam, Chinese troops were meeting VPA, Vietnamese People Army squads, that were much more heavily armed. They would have one RPG, one grenade launcher, one light machine gun, and then everybody else in the Vietnamese squad would have an AK. Whereas in a PLA squad, as you probably know, there would be just two AKs, maybe three if they had been up-armed a little bit, and then four SKSs, and finally a single light machine gun where the assistant machine gunner didn't even have a personal weapon. He was just an ammo bearer. So that was a weight of fire problem that was very, very serious. And the PLA would always come up short against an equally sized Vietnamese counterpart. In fact, the PLA doctrine soon came to be that they would need four squads to overcome one Vietnamese squad just because of this disparity in small arms power. But another problem beyond weight of fire was simply weight. The PLA was still carrying their Type 56 squad machine gun, the 5.56班用机枪, which was an RPD. They loved that RPD, and it served them well. However, the Vietnamese squads they were fighting were flitting nimbly around the Vietnamese bush with these agile little RPK light machine guns that weighed less than two-thirds what the RPD did. That's a big deal. A Chinese squad could only move as fast as its 16-pound belt-fed chunker of an RPD could move. Maneuvering against a squad who was lighter and faster, but they still had three times as much firepower. It had to have been like playing basketball when you're wearing a suit of armor. And that was especially maddening for an army like the PLA, who had always thought of its mobility and its agility as its great strength for combating enemies who had more firepower. Well, that game plan was just completely outdated now. Finally, we got to the subtlest and worst part, which was the logistics. See, remember that the Type 56 family of Chinese small arms wasn't really a true small arms family with shared parts and magazines. No, the SKS used stripper clips. The AK took banana mags, and the RPDs fed from belts. If the RPD ran low on ammo, there was no quickly passing over SKS stripper clips to keep the machine gun running. And you could not cannibalize parts from an SKS to fix up an AK. Maybe that wouldn't have been a huge deal for the PLA if their logistics had just been better. But friends, as you know, early in the war, PLA logistics were lousy, not good. And so was the PLA's operational mobility. The PLA was not set up to operate far from its own rail network. I mean, just witness the amount of mule transport that they had to rely on. So, when China adopted the Type 81 family, that was a huge help. Because finally, China had what they'd been wanting for a long time, which was a gun with very sharp combat accuracy and automatic fire, and the troops loved the 81, just adored it for very good reason. And this marked the first time that Chinese troops didn't have to envy the weapons of the Vietnamese enemies that they were fighting. So now stories began to be told of Chinese units down in Vietnam picking up a new tactic. If a unit's progress got stopped by, say, a Vietnamese pillbox that had a machine gun in it, the word was that Chinese troops now just needed a pair of riflemen who had Type 81 dashes to maneuver up to within 100 meters or more of the Vietnamese pillbox. And then from there, the story says, as long as they could see the embrasure of the pillbox, two riflemen could take it in turns to keep slotting bullets into that embrasure so consistently that the machine gun crew inside couldn't raise their heads to return fire without getting them perforated because those Type 81 dashes were so accurate. That's the story. And also, don't discount the importance of the 81 dash as an icon of the PLA in one of China's happiest periods. That was the 1980s. In China, the 80s were a hopeful, bright, prosperous decade. There was this frisson of sex appeal in the air, too. And even government propaganda posters were getting into like the worldwide disco sensation. So at the 1984 National Day Parade through Tiananmen Square, the Gate of Heavenly Peace, the PLA unveiled its new Type 81 rifle. And this became the icon for the 80s PLA. I would kind of liken it to 80s China's version symbolically of maybe the British Army's FAL after the Falklands War, when, at least in my eyes, that FAL became the icon for Thatcher's Britain, muscular and resurgent, all chin up and brave and showing the world that Britain mattered. For China, that was the Type 81. It was a picture of China back on its feet, modernizing itself and defended by the PLA, which had held China together faithfully through the Cultural Revolution and now was ready to stand on guard for China and deal out ass whoopings to the saucy Vietnamese. Cough, cough. And here's the important part. It was going back to a really cool tradition of being able to take Soviet military stuff and then make little marginal improvements by adding dashes of China's own special sauce. The Type 81 rifle did have some Kalashnikov heritage. Even Chinese patriots will not deny this. Even a stinking intellectual like me can see it from a mile away. And truthfully, it really is not just a Kalashnikov clone. The 81 had some unusual features. One, for example, a very obvious one, is that it's longer than a Kalashnikov, specifically in its receiver. A Type 81 looks a lot like somebody grabbed an AK receiver between the trigger guard and the magwell, and then they stretched it out about 3 inches. That's the easiest way to tell a Type 81 at a distance from a regular Kalashnikov. It's that noticeable gap. I, for some reason, I always think of it as leaving a space for the Holy Spirit to prevent the toxic buildup of Mao Zedong thought between the trigger guard and the magwell so that the Mao Zedong thought can't build up to a critical mass and cause like man-made famine or a political reign of terror. There's also a good mechanical reason for that extra space in the receiver, and we'll talk about that later. But first, another obvious visual difference. If you look at the right side of that Type 81 receiver, you can also recognize that it's not a Kalashnikov because it's missing that classic AK combination safety and dust cover. The Chinese designers had discovered now that ergonomics weren't just for vile Western bourgeoisie. And they put some work into that Type 81. And one thing they did was move the safety from the right side over left so that it would be near the shooter's thumb so that he could operate it without moving his shooting hand very far. Also, you can see from a distance that its front sight post is all the way back here. And that leaves the muzzle clear as this nice unobstructed spigot for launching rifle grenades. And finally, look at this, friends. Something you never thought you would see on a PLA rifle. It's a detachable bayonet. Now, if you ask me, this Type 81 bayonet epitomizes what's actually the biggest deal about the Type 81 rifle. More about that later. But first, we have to acknowledge, despite the sensitivities of our Chinese nationalist friends, that the 81 is not that different from a Kalashnikov either. We'll go through this step by step as we learn about where the Type 81 actually came from. But the fact is, there's nothing unique in a Type 81. When people call a Type 81 a Kalashnikov variant or something, Chinese people can get very shirty and they insist that the Type 81 is not a Kalashnikov at all. It's a total departure. It's uniquely Chinese. That's going too far. Friends, if I hand my toddler a Mr. Potato Head and he takes off the mustache and he gives Mr. Potato Head a different hat, I'm not going to stand here and claim that my toddler just created an original work of art that's unique to him. No. And to give China its due, right now, I just want to say it's good that the 81 is not unique. It's good that it didn't attempt to break any new ground. Really, the designers made zero effort to do anything truly unique to its internals, its styling, its function, or even its materials. They just stuck, for example, with the traditional Chinese catalpa wood furniture. Because remember, the 81 was supposed to be a temporary transitional design, even though it wasn't, even though China ended up keeping it longer than they thought they would. And that was actually probably a lucky thing, too, because that conservatism in their design mentality meant that they got a gun that was safely within Chinese manufacturing's comfort zone to make a good quality service weapon. And so that's why the 81 was China's first gun design that was really, really good. Not like pat on the head, oh, you made such a good effort kind of good, but like actually worthy of a rising power in the 20th century. And where the 81 Dash actually did veer strongly away from its Kalashnikov parentage, you're going to be very surprised about where that other DNA actually came from. But I get ahead of myself. The third part of our myth, the big whopper in the story, is that China did not develop the 81 at warp speed, not even close. People will usually tell you the following. They'll say, well, it was conceived in 1979, right after China invaded Vietnam and got spanked. And then they called a meeting of all the various stakeholders in Chinese military industry. And then the story continues. The rifle had its specs outlined at that meeting in 79, and then it was adopted in 81, and it finally entered production in 1983. Doot, doot, doot. Well, okay, there's nothing in that story that is a lie, but it omits so much relevant information that it's kind of like, I did not have sexual relations with that woman, and it depends on what the definition of is. See, it turns out that version of events chops years and years off both ends of the story at the beginning and the end, and it robs the story of a lot of its really terrific entertainment. And it also creates some needless mysteries, like the classic one, why was China pulling out the stops to produce a bunch of Type 56 AKs in the 1980s during their ongoing war with Vietnam, instead of forgetting about the AK and producing the much, much better 81 Dash? Why was Factory 296, the home of the Type 81, producing AKs instead of Type 81s? Okay, so what's the actual story? We have to go way, way into the past. The PLA's brass did have a huge meeting in 1979 after the Vietnam invasion, and they did get religion about adopting assault rifles. And they did sweep away the last vestiges of doubt among the septuagenarian marshals who still thought that select fire was dumb. All of that is true. However, China did not start the second generation automatic rifle program then because it had already existed And it was thriving for years before that. How many years? Oh, well, here's a hint. Another name for that second generation automatic rifle program was the 步冲合一, the combined rifle and submachine gun, or rifle and subgun in one project. Friends, if that rings a bell in your mind from way long ago in this course, I'm very proud, and that satisfies me that I do not suck as a teacher, because that project went all the way back to the 1950s, back when the Type 56 family was itself new and exciting. Even then, remember, China's ever parsimonious army was already thinking, I wonder if we can make this even cheaper. I wonder if we can lump together the rifle function and the subgun function into one product so that then we only have to manufacture one service weapon for everybody. Well, friends, that's exactly what the US Army was thinking at the same time. And that's what gave them the M14. And if you're a fan of this channel, then A, you are extremely cool. And B, you know that China attempted the very same thing at the very same time, and that's what produced the Type 63 automatic rifle. Remember, that Type 63, that was incredibly close to the American M14 in form and function, and also in failure. In fact, we have two previous episodes about that because the failure was so very spectacular and tragic because it did not have to end that way. But here's the huge reveal, friends. Here's the happy ending about the Type 63 that I've concealed from you for over a year. It was not the end of the road for the Type 63. The reality of it was like a kung fu movie. The Type 63 was murdered, but his orphan son hid away in the southwestern mountains, mastered his father's style of kung fu, and blended it with another style. And then 10 years later, he emerged to avenge his father's death. You see, friends, after the Type 63 flopped, it didn't just vanish. It's easy to forget this, but the Central Military Commission did not officially kill the Type 63 until 1976. Of course, by that time, the very name of the Type 63 rifle was poison, and actual Army commands would have nothing to do with the Type 63, even if that just meant that they had to go back to the SKS. However, the designers and engineers kept tinkering away back at Factory 296, home of the SKS and of the Type 63 rifle. For all those years, those designers and engineers never gave up on the Type 63. Or to be more precise, they never gave up on the idea of the combination rifle submachine gun. Neither did the Army's Ordnance Bureau or other individuals in the myriad civilian military offices who together formed the kind of like cloudy organization that was China's military industrial complex. In their basements, in their back rooms, they kept conducting research and trying some new operating systems out. Some of them were really wacky, but others were incrementally improving on past breakthroughs. And generally, they moved the ball forward on what now increasingly was being called the second generation automatic rifle program, the 第二代自动步枪. But a lot of people were still calling it by its old 50s, 60s name, the combination gun. You see, friends, there was no clear border between the Type 63 rifle, the second generation automatic rifle project of the 70s, and then the eventual Type 81. What they did do was clear away a lot of the prejudices in their thinking that had made the Type 63 rifle such an old-fashioned flop. More like M14, only worse than modernized AK. So they opened up the competition to a lot of other design groups out there. People who were pursuing more or less wacky avenues of development, but some of these turned out to be actually quite competitive and helpful. And they influenced what finally became the Type 81. More about that in a few minutes. However, when the competition was over and the Type 81 rifle was Dingxing, or given its final form to give the closest English equivalent to a sort of slippery Chinese term, the Type 81 apple did not fall very far from the Type 63 tree. Yes, it was the acorn that outgrew the oak, I grant you, but it was still an oak. See, never mind the exterior styling of the Type 81, which did look superficially like an AK, but it was because of that big AK banana mag. And if you put a banana mag on my face where my nose belongs, I too will look superficially like an AK. But take away that superficial form factor, and you'll find that the internals of the Type 81 and its design principles are pretty much like a Type 63. And furthermore, that's not a huge shocker when you learn who designed the Type 81. You see, even though China doesn't like to put a designer's name on a gun in the Russian fashion, and even though China didn't announce like a competition and announce a winner because everybody is on a big cooperative socialist team together, nevertheless, the prototype that became the Type 81 rifle came from, drumroll, good old Factory 296. Yes, that one. The home of the SKS, the home of the Type 63. Those guys never gave up on the Type 63. They kind of kept the flame burning, if only in their private workshops. And they dropped the name of the Type 63, they dropped the styling and everything else that was toxic about it, but they retained what they thought was the good stuff, and eventually they gave China its best rifle to date. As we've been saying, the Type 81 was a pretty conservative gun in a good way, a reliable gun, largely because it had all that Type 63 DNA in it. For example, like its previous incarnation, the Type 63, it had this adjustable gas system. Only this time, it included a setting for rifle grenades. More about that in a moment. Friends, I don't know how I forgot to mention this, but it also has a short stroke gas piston, pretty much taken directly from the Type 63 rifle. Also, they made the Type 81 more user-friendly and ergonomic. It had a bolt hold open, like the Type 63. They moved the safety to a more convenient and ergonomic place above the pistol grip near the shooter's right thumb. They used an inline stock to help controllability. And they actually measured their soldiers this time to see what the best pull length would be. I expect that was tricky because the Chinese gene pool is very broad and it covers a lot of north to south distance. And so it includes both a lot of the big, tall northerners that the PLA made a special effort to recruit, but it also draws a lot from Southeast Asian DNA that includes plenty of men who are a lot closer to 5 feet than to 6. But to the extent that the designers could, they actually made this one fit the bodies of the soldiers they actually had, and not some model that had been inherited from the Soviet Union. Also, the Type 81, which was famously accurate, took a lot of those accurizing measures from the Type 63. The designers came as close as they could to putting the guide rails for the bolt and the recoil spring and the gas piston down as close as possible to the bore axis itself. They also lengthened that receiver between the magwell and the trigger guard so that the bolt could travel an extra inch or more. That would give it more time to slow down and take some of that frenetic pinball energy out of the action of the Kalashnikov. Just anything to make the operating system a little smoother, a little less jangly, so that the shooter could hold it steadier, especially in automatic fire. So that translated really well into quicker follow-up shots and tighter groups. Also, that longer stroke was easier on the gun, which gave it a lot more longevity. The Chinese AKs always had a problem with the trunnions cracking. It also gave more time and space for cartridges to eject and feed reliably, even though the designers were taking away that huge gas pressure that had helped make the Chinese AK run so reliably. And to achieve that smoother design, They had to keep the tolerances tighter on the Type 81. So that actually took some quality control so that the gas block and the gas plug and the gas piston all actually fit together snugly. That combination had to be a little bit finicky to be so smooth. And so that did mean that the Type 81 actually had to be kept clean. It wouldn't tolerate conditions like we saw in our recent episode about Wang Zhijun in 1979, where his squad fought for over 2 weeks without cleaning their rifles. No, that was not going to work with the 81. But that was a more than acceptable trade-off to get kind of like SKS and Type 63 accuracy and finesse into something that had the durability of 56 AK. One other really weird inheritance from the Type 63 that got jettisoned, thankfully quickly, was that in the beginning, they were actually planning to give 20 round magazines to the Type 81 rifle, just like in the Type 63. The PLA had this obsession with making magazines short enough so that the rifleman could hug the ground really well. That got quickly changed into an option between a 20 round magazine and a 30 round magazine. And then finally, the 30 rounders were so popular that they just quickly stopped making 20 rounders at all. Well, the hero who helped push the PLA towards some of these more forward looking modern measures so that they didn't end up with just another improved Type 63. That hero was a man that we've touched on briefly before, a man named Tongar. You remember him from a story where he was a foreign American trained small arms engineering specialist who had the extra bad luck not only to have studied abroad, but also to have once worked for the nationalists, which meant that he had a very hard time in the Cultural Revolution. However, he was a guy who was so competent that even his imaginary thought crimes couldn't keep him down. And eventually, even while he was a political prisoner, his captors brought him back to the factory to keep basically fixing their mistakes, even while he was theoretically being punished. Well, by the 1970s, after Tung Ar-kang was what they called rehabilitated, meaning exonerated of the imaginary political thought crimes, he got a really cool new job. This was awesome. His job was to speak for the army to the military industrial complex about what the army wanted. In the 1970s in China, this was kind of a new thing. The main bosses of arms production in China were a government ministry in Beijing that back then was called the Fifth Machinery Building Ministry, Jibu. And by the way, I have huge affection for that ministry because I used to live right down the street and I worked for one of their cousin ministries. So the Fifth Ministry was certainly not unaffiliated with the military, but they were connected to the military in the way that, say, Raytheon is connected to the US military. Meaning, I'm sure Raytheon has the Pentagon on speed dial, and they have signal chats going with a small army of lieutenant colonels from the Air Force who know everything there is to know about electrical engineering and government procurement and even doctrine. But I don't think Raytheon's C-suite execs and their code monkeys are like doing PT runs in the morning with the infantry grunts and going to strip clubs with them at Fort Benning. That's probably a good thing. Well, in China, the army, what we might call the real army, the guys in green sneakers who go on forced marches, they wanted an institutional representative who would have a seat at the table when weapons were being designed at the ministry in Beijing. Very smart. So that person, that designee, ended up becoming Chang Ar-kang. In the late 70s, then, as all of China's far-flung design teams were each trying to put their own ideas forward for this nebulous second-generation automatic rifle project, Chang Ar-kang was putting out a series of position papers enunciating what to us nowadays just seemed like common sense. Namely, he was urging that China's squad weapons should henceforth be short to make them handy in vehicles and trenches and jungles. They should have pistol grips. They should have detachable bayonets that could double as daggers and didn't constantly have to be weighting down the front of a gun. The guns should be able to fire rifle grenades, and they should be good enough at burst fire that they could deal with area targets and not just point targets. Also, they should comprise squad weapons families, true families, so that, say, the rifle and the light machine gun could exchange parts and magazines, not just ammunition. So, like the standard loadout became a rifle with five 30-round mags or a light machine gun with four drums of 75 rounds. And you could feed the light machine gun with the banana mags from the rifles, and vice versa, actually. Well, basically, Tongar Kang and people like him had been looking at families of small arms abroad, particularly the Steyr Og and the Galil. And kind of like the parable of Plato's cave, they were bringing that light back to China and trying to force feed it to the PLA decision makers. Tung must have been a very persuasive man because he got buy-in then for the concepts that became the Type 81 family. As that family was originally conceived, it was supposed to have four members: a light machine gun, a rifle, and the two would have 70% interchangeable parts. Then also, they were going to have a folding stock version of the service rifle, and finally, a short-barreled version of the rifle, specifically for paratroopers and recon soldiers. Now, that's almost what happened, but they simplified that family further. The first thing to go was the shorty version of the rifle. Remember, that would only have been for paratroopers and recon troops. And if they changed the barrel length, they discovered they were going to have to change the gas system and who knows how many other variables. And they decided that was a dumb effort to put into something that really was just supposed to be a transitional rifle. And since the shorty version was never going to be more than a boutique gun intended for a small number of elite units, they just decided, forget it. We're not going to open up that big can of worms for what's always going to be a niche gun and a temporary niche gun. Eventually, they filled that niche in with the Type 56C. Ian at Forgotten Weapons has a video about that, and eventually we'll do one here. So next, they took away another member of the family, and this one's a surprise. They took away the service rifle proper. If you've noticed, when I'm paying attention, I tend to say the 81 dash instead of just the Type 81. And in Chinese, you always talk about the Bai Gang, the 81 dash. Here's the reason for that. At the outset, the rifle came out in two flavors. There was one with a fixed catalpa wood stock, which was designated the Type 81 rifle. But approved the very same time as that was a side-folding version with a stock that they actually took off the Type 56-2 AK, which was an invention of Factory 626, the home of the AK. And so that side-folding version was designated Type 81-1. So the wood-stocked version of the Type 81 and its side-folding version came out at the very same time, but it quickly emerged that the side-folding version was so very satisfactory that very, very quickly they just ditched the regular Type 81 proper with its fixed wooden stock. They just stopped manufacturing it. I don't think that any more than 40,000 were ever made. And in PLA terms, that's nothing. So that left the PLA with one service rifle, officially designated the Type 81-1. Again, a name that no one ever uses. It's just the 81 dash, Bai Gang. And as I mentioned, they also changed the magazines at this time, where before they had wanted a 100-round magazine for the light machine gun, they settled for 75 rounds. Where originally they had foreseen a 20-round magazine for the rifle, they decided that actually that was pretty medieval, and they just made 30-rounders standard. So doctrine was evolving. However, in my mind, the most impressive evidence of doctrinal evolution was this: the Type 81 bayonet. Why? Because it was detachable. This thing symbolized that even the aging marshals in Beijing, who had started fighting in the 1930s, sometimes with actual corps of spearmen or swordsmen, even they were now accepting that the PLA would never again be an army of bayonet fighters first. Now, when this thing made it down to Vietnam, it still saw a lot of use, but it saw use more as a dagger. There were still a lot of Chinese recon units doing a good bit of old-fashioned PLA infiltrating and creepy crawly snake-eating ninja stuff, and they ended up using knives a lot for that. So it turned out this was a real asset, and it was a boon that it would come off the rifle. Did a few soldiers lose their bayonets, even though they weren't pinned permanently to the muzzles of their guns? Maybe, but this was a real win, especially if they were trying to compete with the VPA on carry weight of their weapons. Fantastic. Here's one more pound of metal that doesn't need to be bolted onto the end of a soldier's gun, which is the most ergonomically disadvantageous place to carry weight. But speaking of Vietnam, here's the other part of the great myth of the Type 81. It didn't get used in Vietnam that much. Why? Why were factories in China actually churning out a bunch more Type 56 AKs to send to the PLA to use in Vietnam throughout the 1980s? Why was even Factory 296, the home of the Type 81 project itself, still making these ancient AKs? It's simple. The Type 81 was still not ready. It wasn't ready in 1981 when it got its name. It wasn't ready in 1984 when it was unveiled at the National Day Parade. I mean, I'm not saying that those guns at the parade were AI holograms. No, they were real. And the factory had produced some smallish runs of Type 81s, but they were boutique guns at that point. They were not mass production guns because the gun was still not approved for mass production. It still had to go back in the oven and bake a few years longer. See, there's a thing about the Chinese system that confuses Westerners all the time, and it even confuses a lot of Chinese people. We think that calling a gun something like the Type 81 means that it entered service in 1981, but that's not exactly true in the way that it sounds. It means that the gun entered the PLA's official inventory list, it 入列, in 1981. And it means that the model was quote unquote finalized, what Chinese calls 定型. But that doesn't really mean final. A lot of things are still malleable at that stage. And being finalized is still a completely separate administrative category from being accepted for mass production. 量产定型. These two things can come years apart. So that's the reason, for example, that Americans used to call the Type 63 by the misnomer Type 67. 1967 was the year that it got put into production. So if memory serves, like I've seen a bunch of like old declassified CIA documents that refer to this mysterious new Chinese rifle popping up in Vietnam, and they call it the Type 67. That's why. Because 4 years elapsed between accepting the Type 63 rifle and actually approving it to be mass produced. Because in Chinese nomenclature, those are separate things. The weapon gets its name from its year of military acceptance. The most extreme example is like the Type 64 pistol, which was accepted in 1964, but then it sat on a shelf without even being manufactured until the year of our Lord 1980. That's why this gun came into PLA service in 1980 that looked like this outdated thing that had come out of a time machine. So the Type 81 took a long time to get mass produced because there was still all this stuff that had to be ironed out. This was the cost of that supposed warp speed development. For example, the light machine gun needed a lot of changes. One problem was that drum magazine. I'm told that drums are notoriously hard to make, and they'd been having trouble with the spring. If you're tuning in for the first time, Chinese designs of this period always seemed to have trouble with their springs. So the poor, long-suffering General Logistics Department, see our earlier episode about that, they agreed to a change of plan. Originally, they had really wanted a 100-round drum that would match the old 100-round belts of their Type 56 RPD light machine gun. But since the drums just couldn't feasibly hold that much, they reduced the capacity to 75 rounds. Not shabby. I mean, it kept pace with the RPK. But a worse problem for the light machine guns were the trunnions. They had gotten those just strong enough in the rifle to meet the specs. The rifle's trunnions would last for 15,000 rounds, which was everything that they had been hoping for. However, the light machine gun was being held to a higher endurance standard, and it could not make it. The trunnions kept cracking. So the machine gun repeatedly flunked tests, and it didn't get approved for mass production until 1985. So this is yet another example of that long lag that can happen between when a PLA gun is accepted for military service and when it's actually put into production and used. The Type 81 rifle did better than the light machine gun, but it also had to make some changes. It was still too heavy to be acceptable. The Central Military Commission would not budge on their weight limit. They wanted it to come in at 3.5 kilograms empty, and they meant it. And to be fair, the Chinese soldier had heavier ammo than his American and Soviet counterparts, and he did a lot more walking with a lot less body weight. And friends, according to at least one very cool scientist who studies these things, ruck speed is a function of lean body weight. So that's a big deal, and I'm proud of the Central Military Commission for not budging on that weight limit. But there was another problem too with the rifles, even after they worked out that poundage problem. That was the stocks were still cracking. They'd had the very same problem with the old Type 63 rifle too. They were trying hard to meet size and weight limits, and so they shaved the stock down, and that caused trouble. That Chinese catalpa wood that the PLA liked to use for its gun stocks was easy to work with, and it had a real advantage in that it would resist swelling in dampness and humidity. And it was affordable to the extent that any wood was affordable in China, which was basically deforested for dynasties. But damn it, it was really hard to make those stocks light enough, but also durable enough. But that turned out to be an easy fix. They just abandoned the wooden butts, and they ditched the Type 81 rifle for the 81 Dash with that nice side folding stock made of metal. They might have liked to use plastic furniture entirely for the 81 Dash, but they weren't confident that they could do it without causing more problems than they solved. Friends, it's a really good thing that the 81 Dash was as durable as it was because it stuck around for a long time. It turned out not to really be a transitional rifle. Yes, it was there to use up the PLA's stocks of 7.62 ammo while they developed their new, smaller cartridge. But far from being just a stepping stone from the Type 56 family to the new QBZs of the future, the Type 81 stuck around and became a mainstay for a lot longer than anybody expected because the QBZ took so long to come online. Theoretically, it entered service in 1995, but friends, you know the story by now. The real rollout didn't come till 1997, and that was still as a boutique gun. It was used to arm the new Hong Kong PLA garrison's troops. I can't even think how long it took for real soldiers in the companies to have their 81 dashes displaced by QBZs in great numbers. And I'll also tell you, people were not happy to see the Type 81 go. Thankfully, it's still in pretty significant use. At least within the last decade, the 81 Dash has still been in use in the PLA Air Force, the PLARF, the PLA Rocket Force, also the Wujing, the People's Armed Police, and some border defense troops. Why is that? Well, a lot of times people will say things like, well, you see, in the longer fields of fire around Air Force bases or the Central Asian borderlands, the heavier bullet weight of the 7.62 cartridge will carry stopping power all the way out to 500 or 600 meters, and that's why those units still use the 81 Dash. Okay, that sounds reasonable, but I think it's complete bollocks. I think it's just because the PLA never throws anything away. And the PLA Air Force and the PLA Rocket Force and the Wujing are not small arms first battle fighting units. They're guarding static installations. They're not as limited by weight as line infantry who are campaigning in the field for weeks at a time. Those units are not expected to need the better precision for guard duty that you can get out of, say, the new small caliber bullets. They're not expected to need the better optics that you can put on the QBZ series. And just speaking from my heart, the 81 Dash really does just look cooler. The Type 95 QBZ looks dorky and cheap. The 81 Dash looks like a man's gun. In fact, friends, in the Wujing, in the People's Armed Police, when a young soldier completes his training and he goes through the solemn ceremony where he's issued his gun, at that ceremony, he is handed an 81 Dash, even if his unit actually uses the QBZ 95. I mean, after the ceremony, he'll still have to hand back the 81 Dash to the quartermaster. But at the ceremony where he ritually becomes a soldier, even the Communist Party is not going to emasculate the poor lad by handing him this plastic thing that looks like a FAMAS got drunk and mated with a Buck Rogers comic book. That would be terrible. No, friends, at least for people of my age, the Type 81 is the 永远的8一杠, the eternal 81 Dash, and we will have no truck with plastic small caliber weapons. Friends, I would like to thank Hunting Gear Guy for his fantastic photos of the Type 81, and I'd like to direct you to his fine blog review and YouTube review of the Type 81, which is available in Canada to civilian shooters. Friends, if you like this sort of content, please like and subscribe, please comment, and you might even visit our Patreon page to support the work that we do here. But friends, this course remains free to all the world's workers, soldiers, and peasants. I'm Jason Clower. I cannot wait to talk to you next time.